At the family reunion, no one saved me a seat. My grandson looked at me and said, "You can just stand over there." That was the sentence. Not screamed, not whispered, just said, like reading from a grocery list. I had arrived early, out of habit, out of respect, out of love, I suppose. It was the anniversary of the family business. 35 years. A company my son claimed he had built from the ground up. He used to say that when he was 10 years old, too, only, back then, he said it while standing on the ground, I had laid brick by brick. The hall was pristine. Light filled the room like a warm promise. Tables were covered in linen. Golden name cards shimmered. Toasts were being prepared. Screens played a looping slideshow of milestones. A ribbon cutting here, a warehouse expansion there. People were laughing at old office photos. Everyone had a place. Everyone. But me. I stood near the back, adjusting the collar of my old brown jacket. The same jacket I wore when I helped fix the first delivery truck. The same jacket I wore when I signed as co-guarantor on the original business loan. It didn't fit well anymore, but I wore it like armor. I waited, assuming it was a mistake. Someone must have forgotten to mark my place. Maybe I was at the head table? I scanned each white card. Sarah, Benjamin, Claire, Aunt Lynn, marketing team, board members. But nowhere was the name Harold, my name, the name etched in ink on the very first product shipment. I walked toward my son. He stood near the stage, beaming, shaking hands with clients, embracing distant relatives. He saw me, I know he did, and he hesitated, just for a second. But then he turned, greeted someone else. Didn't even wave, didn't nod. And when I tried to step forward, it was my grandson who caught me off guard. A boy I once rocked to sleep on my knee. He looked up from his phone and said it like he was helping. "Hey, Grandpa, there's no seat for you, but you can just stand over there." No malice, just instruction. As if I were the delivery man who stayed too long. And so I did. I stood by the wall, right beside the coat rack, in silence. I looked at the chairs, the plates, the silverware. Each one weighed heavier than the last, because each one reminded me of a place I no longer held. No one meant harm. That's the part that stung the most. They didn't exclude me to hurt me. They just didn't think of me at all. And in that moment, I realized something cruel about growing older. It's not that people push you out. It's that they stop noticing you're even there. But I stayed, not for the recognition, not for the thanks. I stayed because I needed to remember how it felt. To be forgotten. Friends, I'll take a short pause here. Could you let us know in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever gone through something similar in your own life? Or maybe seen it happen to someone close to you? If this story touches something inside you, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. That's how you help us keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's continue. They clinked glasses, laughed loud, and passed dishes he once taught them to cook. A celebration of family. Or at least, that's what the banner said. He stood quietly near the far wall, just beyond the glow of the chandelier. No one glanced his way, not even once. The seat beside the cake, taken. The chair he used to occupy at every family event, filled by a cousin who barely knew his birthday. There had been no accident here, no oversight. It was simply that he had not been considered. A grandchild darted past, laughing. He remembered when that same child would run into his arms, yelling, "Grandpa!" and pulling at his coat. Now, not even eye contact, just a blur in motion, as if he was a column in the room, not a man. The son raised a glass for a toast. Everyone hushed. The father listened, not out of interest, but out of memory. He had taught that boy how to speak to people. He had told him, "Mean what you say what you mean." But now the son was a man with polished shoes and manicured timing. "To family," he said, "to those who matter most." The words hung in the air. He looked down at his hands. Strong hands. Hands that once carried them all, through school fees, hospital nights, mortgage papers. These hands had never failed them. But today they had no hand to hold. He wasn't angry. That had passed. What replaced it was harder to describe. A kind of quiet weight. Not grief, not sorrow, more like being erased while still alive. Not one person asked, "Are you okay standing?" No one said, "Come join us." No gesture, no smile, not even a glance. And still he stayed. Because part of him, the part that still believed in family, hadn't left yet. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of each memory fall into place. Decades ago, this was nothing but a broken-down warehouse. Broken windows, crumbling bricks, a shell of echoes. He had stood here then, shoulders bent under the weight of his own dreams and those of his family. And he had laid every brick by hand. Mortar laced between his fingers. Sweat stung his eyes as he lifted each block into place, not once stopping to wonder if anyone would thank him. He did it for them, for his children, for his grandchildren, for every neighbor who would one day walk these floors and feel shelter instead of collapse. He remembered the nights he worked beneath a single bare bulb, the hum of a generator his only soundtrack. The winter wind howled through the gaps in the boards, but he wrapped his coat tighter and kept going. He remembered the first beams he hoisted above his head, legs trembling, heart steady with purpose. He remembered welding the skeletal frame for the mezzanine where future birthdays would be celebrated, where toasts would be made, where laughter would echo under a ceiling he had raised. He remembered the day he painted the walls himself, brush in hand, mixing colors under a dusty skylight, his granddaughter skipping beside him, dipping her fingers in the wet paint and leaving tiny handprints as evidence that children were meant to play here, to dream here. He remembered her laughter when the paint splashed her shoes, and how he lifted her up to rinse them, treasuring the light in her eyes. That hall had been his gift, not for himself, but for community, a place where weddings would bloom, where fundraisers would gather hope, where family reunions, like this one, would stand as testament to roots deeper than any contract. He remembered how full it had been when the ribbon first fell away, the crowd's applause echoing off fresh plaster, the hope in his wife's smile as she took his hand. And yet today none of them remembered the hands that shaped the walls, the back that bent absorbing each brick's weight, the quiet sacrifice of his hours. Today, the very space he built to hold them all, he could not occupy. His heart tightened as he pictured himself then, young, strong, unafraid of height or hammer. His hands had been tools of transformation. Nothing had fallen without his guidance, but now he was just a stranger, leaning against a pillar, invisible to the ones who once called this place home. He drew a slow breath, tasting the lacquer on the banister still fresh from the renovations he oversaw years ago. The same banister children would slide down when they were too impatient for stairs. The same banister he had sanded smooth, so no splinters marred happy memories. He felt his pulse beneath his collar, steady but heavy. He looked at the empty chairs around the main table, empty, waiting for him. And he realized that a seat, however polished, was meaningless without acknowledgement. He straightened his shoulders and whispered into the stillness only he felt, "I built this for you." And in that confession he found a spark, an ember of resolve. Because if a hall could stand without its builder inside, he could still stand for his own worth, even if no one saw, even if no one cared. He would remember every brick, every beam, every laugh and tear born under this roof. And if they never offered him a seat, he would stand, knowing he had already raised the place that held them all. The laughter hummed like soft thunder through the hall. Champagne glasses clinked, music floated lightly over the air, and the rhythm of celebration pulsed around him. But amidst the swirling joy, something else reached his ears, a whisper, faint but sharp enough to cut through the noise like a sliver of glass. "Who's that?" a voice asked behind a cluster of guests near the dessert table. "The owner's father, I think." "Oh, why isn't he sitting?" A shrug, then a quiet reply that hit harder than any raised voice. "Not his place anymore. He's retired." That word, retired, as if it meant invisible, irrelevant, discarded like a worn-out coat after winter. He didn't turn, didn't flinch, just lowered his gaze and studied the floor he once laid tile by tile with blistered fingers. He remembered kneeling for hours, smoothing grout with the side of his thumb, humming to himself while sunlight warmed the unfinished room. Back then he thought the pain in his knees would be worth it, because this would be a space for his children to grow, to lead, to host others with pride. And they did grow. They did lead. They did host. But they forgot. He remembered how his son had once helped him carry plywood here, barely 10 years old, wobbling under the weight, but smiling when his father patted his shoulder. "You'll make something here some day," he had said. Now his son stood center stage, the owner whose name was etched on the new plaque outside. He had done well. Clean suits, big deals, social media mentions with designers and officials. People shook his hand with reverence, called him visionary. No one asked who placed the first nail, who paid for the wiring when no bank would give a loan, who skipped meals to buy a second-hand generator when permits delayed electricity. And now they whispered like he was a distant relative, a misplaced guest. He glanced down at his coat, clean but modest, the shoes polished that morning, hands folded in front of him like a schoolboy trying not to be in the way. He wasn't bitter, number, but in that moment he felt the heavy ache of being unseen, not unloved perhaps, but unsummoned. He didn't want fanfare. He had lived a life of quiet pride. He didn't crave applause or toasts, but to be forgotten in the very house he built? That left a silence louder than music. He leaned back gently against the wall, letting its coolness steady him. Around him, guests laughed at jokes he didn't hear, raised glasses to stories that had no trace of him in them. He remembered once telling his wife, back when the building was barely a skeleton, "They'll never know how much of us we leave in the walls." And maybe that was the point. Maybe love wasn't meant to be noticed. Maybe it was meant to be felt, long after the builder had stepped away from the frame. Still, a chair would have been nice. Not for comfort, but as a sign that they remembered. He stayed by the wall, a quiet cornerstone in a room full of noise. The celebration went on, but something in the foundation shifted. The clinking of glass brought a hush over the room. All eyes turned to the stage where his son, tall, confident, and perfectly composed in his tailored navy suit, raised a golden flute of champagne. The lights dimmed slightly. The music faded. Cameras lifted. Guests leaned in. He stayed where he was, still standing, still near the wall. His son's voice rang out, clear, measured, practiced. "Tonight is about gratitude," he began, scanning the faces of investors, collaborators, and family. "It's about honoring the journey, the team who believed in the dream, the mentors who challenged me, the clients who trusted us." A pause, a gracious smile. He thanked his wife, calling her his lighthouse. He thanked the architect for bringing the vision to life. He even offered a sentimental nod to the local coffee shop where he and his partner had their first breakthrough strategy session. Laughter. Then applause. More names followed. Employees, advisors, suppliers, even the flooring company. But not one glance toward the man who taught him how to hold a hammer. Not one word about the man who filled out his first business registration form. Not one breath spent on the father who mortgaged his only property so this vision could have a foundation. He stood motionless, the applause rolling past him like wind over a statue. No one turned, and he realized it wasn't malice. It was absence, not a wound that bled, but a slow forgetting, a quiet rewriting of history in which he was simply edited out. The toast continued, his son now speaking about legacy, how this space would be a home for creativity, community, and the future of design. Those words echoed painfully because he remembered saying something similar years ago in that very room. Only there had been no microphones then, just sweat and a hope. He felt his fingers curled gently around the stem of a water glass, the only one left untouched on a nearby tray. He didn't drink from it. He just needed to hold something. When the crowd stood and clapped, when people wiped their eyes from the emotion of the speech, he didn't join in, not out of spite, but because he couldn't. His hands had built too many things to pretend they didn't ache. A woman next to him, unaware of who he was, whispered, "He speaks so well. You can tell he built it all himself." The glass trembled slightly in his hand, and still he stood, not for pride, not for anger, but because sometimes the absence of a name and a thank you can be louder than an insult shouted in a room full of silence. The applause faded behind him like a memory being erased in real time. He didn't rush, didn't make a scene, just turned quietly, as if remembering something he'd forgotten in another room, or in another life. His shoes barely made a sound on the polished floor he once laid down himself, tile by tile, kneeling for hours until his knees ached and his hands blistered. No one noticed his absence, no heads turned, no voices followed. He passed by the doorway where family members laughed with champagne in hand, framed by fairy lights and curated perfection. It could have been a painting, but he wasn't in it. In the hallway, the air was cooler, still, the kind of silence that wraps around you when you're no longer needed in a story you started. He rested one hand gently on the wall. His palm met the familiar curve of plaster he had spread decades ago. Not with gloves, but bare-handed, guiding each stroke as if sculpting the future. Back then it had been an empty warehouse, cold, hollow. The beams creaked, the lights flickered, and yet he saw possibility. His son saw only risk, but he believed anyway, in the boy, in the dream, in the blueprint he wasn't allowed to sign but quietly funded. He closed his eyes. Underneath his fingers he still felt the ridges of a mistake he'd once patched over, a crack that ran too deep. They told him to tear down and rebuild. He didn't. He worked with it, strengthened it from inside, made it hold. And now here he was, leaning on that same wall, not from age, but from weight. The weight of absence, of being erased, of hearing a room applaud a life you helped build, without remembering your name. Down the corridor, laughter swelled again. Another toast, maybe. Another carefully edited story. Still no one came looking for him. He didn't expect them to. His chest rose and fell slowly. There was no bitterness in it, just gravity, the simple, silent kind that bends a man's shoulders over time. He ran his fingers once more over the plaster, then gently tapped the wall, not for sound, but for memory. And then he walked, not to leave, but to let them see what it feels like when the foundation steps outside. The door clicked softly behind him as he stepped further out onto the terrace. The night had grown colder, though the stars above were wide open, indifferent to celebrations, to silences, to forgotten names. He stood by the edge, his back to the light, staring out into the darkness as though it might return something he had lost. Not his youth, that he gave willingly, not his money, that had never been the point. No, what was missing now was weightless, invisible. It was belonging. Recognition not in the form of applause, but of quiet gratitude. Footsteps approached, light ones, hesitant but sure. A young voice said, "Sir?" He turned slightly. A boy, maybe in his early 20s, stood with a glass of water. His uniform was crisp, his name tag polished, but his eyes held something older, something familiar. I thought you might need this," the young man said, extending the glass. He accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you." But the boy didn't leave. He hesitated, then added, softer now, "You probably don't remember me. I was one of the students at the trades college you funded. The new wood shop, that was built with your donation. You never came to the opening, but they showed us a picture. You were younger, standing with your tools, smiling like you didn't know what you'd just built." He smiled faintly. "I didn't need to know. It was enough to hope someone else would." The young man nodded. "We did. We all did. That place changed my life." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just full. The boy glanced over his shoulder toward the glowing hall, then looked back. "They didn't save you a seat in there," he said, "but that doesn't mean you don't have one. Just maybe not at their table." The old man raised an eyebrow. The waiter's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some of us sit higher than they think. Quiet builders, not showmen." There was something in that moment, something stronger than applause, something purer than recognition. It was remembrance, The kind that doesn't need fanfare, only truth. He sipped the water. The cold glass steadied in his hand. The boy cleared his throat. Would you like me to sit with you a moment? I don't have a break, but... The man waved gently. No need. Go back in. You still have your chapter to write. The waiter hesitated, then, with a slight bow, turned and went back inside. And for the first time that night, the old man didn't feel like he was outside the story. He was above it, holding the blueprint, holding the reason, holding the legacy. The envelope had been folded and unfolded so many times. The creases had begun to fray. Its edges were soft now, like the hands that had held it. The same hands that once lifted beams, soldered joints, wiped the tears of a boy who would someday forget. It was still in his pocket. He ran his fingers over it absent-mindedly as he stood outside, the muffled sounds of laughter and forks against porcelain drifting from the room he had helped finance, construct, and warm, with labor, not luxury. Inside the envelope was not just ink on paper, it was a map, a quiet account of the early days when things were built slowly, when failure was close and faith was everything. It spoke of a time when his son had sat beside him on an unfinished floor, legs crossed, watching wide-eyed as sparks flew from a welding torch, asking endless questions about why things needed to be so precise. He had written every detail, the first late payment on a supplier's invoice he'd covered in secret, the long night he'd stayed awake to redo a flawed blueprint, so the grand opening wouldn't be delayed, the time he turned down a loan so his son could take it instead, even the day he moved out of the office to make space for the new direction. There was no bitterness in the letter, only clarity, a soft light shining on truth, not to accuse, but to restore. He had planned to leave it on his son's desk tonight, quietly, just place it there, then leave before the last toast. Let the truth speak louder than his voice ever had. But as his hand rested on the paper now, something inside paused. Not yet. Not because his son didn't deserve it, but because he wasn't ready to hear it. There's a kind of deafness that comes with too much pride, not in achievements, but in forgetting where they came from. And this letter, it wasn't meant to break that pride. It was meant to meet it, gently, when the walls cracked just enough to let light in. He folded it again, slower this time, more carefully, and placed it back in his jacket. Some truths don't need to be delivered. They need to be discovered. He looked up at the sky, dark velvet scattered with star, and thought of the night his son was born, how small and loud and miraculous he'd been, and now how big and silent this distance felt. Still, he waited, not for a thank you, not for a seat, but for the moment when his son would come looking, not for advice, not for help, but for understanding. And when he did, the letter would still be waiting. The clinking of silverware softened. Conversations fizzled into murmurs, then silence. She hadn't raised her voice. The woman, seated near the back of the hall, simply lifted her glass and asked the question with the calm weight of someone who knew its importance. Where is he? The one who laid the first stone. The words didn't echo, but they reverberated, deeply, precisely, like a tuning fork struck against the ribs of the room. The son froze mid-sentence. A half-smile stuck on his face like wet paint that refused to dry. The projector behind him still looped photos of company milestones, of awards, of renovated buildings and ribbon cuttings. He was in every shot, but the foundation, the man in the background, was nowhere. People began to shift in their seats. Some looked toward the front of the hall. Others craned their necks toward the back. But most turned toward the side door, the one that had quietly clicked shut an hour ago when he'd stepped out. He wasn't there. Not in the crowd, not in the lights, not in the room. A few whispered, "Wasn't that his father?" Others exchanged glances, uneasy, guilty, thoughtful. The silence stretched long enough to become undeniable. Even the music paused, as if ashamed to continue. The son cleared his throat. He had something else. I think he's not feeling well. But the lie was too small to cover the shape of the absence. The woman didn't sit down. She lowered her glass with grace, looked at the large poster on the wall that read, "Celebrating Legacy," and gave a soft, almost imperceptible nod. Like a teacher who sees a student miss the point of his own lesson, the silence remained, not awkward, not forced, but reverent. One man at a nearby table muttered, "I remember when they broke ground. He was there. Every day." Another woman nodded. "He funded the scholarships, quietly." A third whispered, "I didn't know that." In that room filled with curated lights and expensive wine, the real legacy had stepped out unnoticed. But now its outline was everywhere, in the floor beneath them, the stage they applauded from, the roof above their heads. And the person they forgot to thank became the presence they couldn't ignore. Outside, beyond the glass doors, he stood under the open sky, alone, but not invisible. Sometimes absence becomes its own kind of spotlight, and sometimes the quietest voice is the one everyone eventually hears. At first the memories come slowly, a few glances exchanged, a furrowed brow, a quiet realization dawning across faces that had, until now, been turned only toward the stage. But then it begins to ripple, like the echo of a stone dropped into a still pond. Someone near the wine table whispers, "Didn't he co-sign that first expansion loan?" A former employee at the far end nods, "Yes." And during the crash in 2008, when the banks pulled out, he used his own retirement to keep payroll going. I remember. Another voice, this one more hesitant, follows. "He used to deliver lunch to the workers when the company couldn't afford a canteen." The buzz grows, but it's not scandal. It's remembrance. Something raw, human, unpolished. Not the kind of curated narrative printed in brochures or blasted on social media, but the kind that lives in back rooms and dusty ledgers, in second chances and sacrifices never spoken aloud. The sun stands frozen at the podium, suddenly aware that the room is no longer looking at him, not with admiration, not even with expectation, but with quiet disappointment. Not cruel, just sobering. He sees a man he hadn't noticed before, older, former maintenance crew, wiping his eyes with a linen napkin. A woman in HR, one of the first hires, now retired, sits back in her chair with a distant look. "He gave me a loan when my husband died," she murmurs. Each story unlocks another. Each voice becomes a thread. And those threads begin to reweave the truth. The company, the family, the celebration itself. None of it was possible without the man who stood alone by the wall, holding his silence with the strength of someone who never needed to speak to matter. Photos on the slideshow continue flipping, now suddenly inadequate. Where is he in those pictures? Where is the man who handed out hard hats and hope? And then someone stands up, not loudly, not dramatically, just rises to their feet in the middle of it all. A gesture, simple, quiet, but unmistakable. Then another, and another, not for the speaker, not for the brand, but for the bricklayer of their beginnings, for the man who never asked to be remembered, yet now could not be forgotten. The room doesn't need to be told what to do. Gratitude, when it finally finds its voice, doesn't shout. It stands. He stepped outside like a man slipping off a suit that no longer fit. The air was cooler than he expected, or maybe it just felt colder after the warmth of applause he hadn't earned alone. Laughter echoed behind him, faint and distant, like a dream that stopped meaning something the moment you woke up. The world outside the venue was quiet, still, except for the sound of his own shoes brushing against concrete as he walked toward a bench barely touched by the light of a crooked lamppost. And there, just as he'd feared, and maybe, deep down, hoped, sat the man he hadn't named all evening, his father. Not hunched, not bitter, not even tired, just still. A presence, a pause in the rush of life. He sat with his hands resting together, fingers interlaced, as if holding something invisible. Not a grudge, not anger, something older than both. His head was slightly lowered, but his eyes didn't drift. They were focused on the darkened street across from them. Not searching, remembering. The sun stood there just out of reach, ashamed that even now he hesitated. "Dad," he finally said. The word stuck to his tongue like something he hadn't practiced saying in too long. The man didn't turn, but he heard. You could always tell with him, not because he moved, but because everything about him seemed to listen. I didn't think, the son began. I didn't think you'd mind. That I didn't mention. He paused. Even now he was trying to talk around the truth. I didn't think it mattered to you. The old man finally turned his head, just slightly, just enough for the lamplight to catch the age on his face, but also the steadiness in his eyes. It's not about being mentioned, he said. No sharpness, just depth. It's about knowing if the ones you lifted still know who lifted them. The son looked down. It was the kind of truth you can't argue with, because it doesn't accuse, it simply exists, and that's worse. I wasn't trying to erase you, he said. I was caught up. The pressure, the expectations. You didn't erase me, the father said, not cruelly. You just blurred me, until I couldn't be recognized. That landed harder than any blame could have, because it was honest, because it was quiet. The son remembered his first broken bike. He remembered small hands gripping a wrench too tight, slipping, falling, crying, and he remembered the calloused hand that helped him up, didn't scold, didn't fix it for him, just held the back wheel steady while he tried again. His father had always been like that, unseen but unshakable. I made the toast to the team, to those who built it, the son muttered. You did, the old man nodded slowly. You thanked the scaffolding, but forgot the ground. It was then the son sat, finally, not like someone joining a pier, like a child returning home, unsure if the door would open, but hoping it might. I don't know how to make this right. His father didn't offer him an answer. He never had. He believed in letting people find the truth themselves, not hand it to them like a gift, but help them build it, like everything else. So he looked forward again into the night and said only this. It's not about the seat. It's about the eyes that look for you to take it. And for the first time that night, the son stopped trying to explain himself. He simply stayed, beside the man who had built the table, and who somehow still made room for him. The room had settled into a kind of silence that didn't come from the absence of sound, but from the weight of what had just happened outside. The sun had returned, quieter than before. His steps were no longer proud. They were careful, as if afraid of waking something he had ignored for too long. His eyes searched the crowd not for applause, but for understanding. The seat at the head of the room, his, looked less like a throne now and more like a borrowed chair he hadn't truly earned alone. And then from the back, almost unnoticed, he came in, the father, not dramatically, not to reclaim anything. He simply walked down the side wall of the hall, his shoulders straight, his steps slow but steady. He found an empty seat in the last row, near the exit, a place you take when you don't want to be seen but still want to witness. People noticed, not all at once, but one by one, as if a wave moved through the crowd, soft but undeniable. Conversations dimmed, laughter faded. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to reflection. She was the first to move, the woman from earlier, the guest who'd raised her glass, asking, "Where's the one who stood at the beginning?" She didn't look around for permission. She walked directly to the back, held something small and black in her hand, the microphone. When she reached him, he looked up, surprised but not embarrassed. She didn't explain, didn't make a speech. She just held it out to him, both hands like an offering. "Sir," she said gently, "we have things we need to hear." The room was still, not frozen, open, waiting. He didn't grab the microphone. He took it slowly, with the reverence of a man who didn't expect to speak tonight. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd assumed no one wanted to listen. And for a moment he sat there, microphone resting in his lap, eyes lowered, like he was deciding whether silence would say more. But then he stood. He didn't walk to the stage. He didn't need it. He stayed where he was in the last row and spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, like wood settling after a long winter. "I built my life with hands that didn't mind the dirt," he began. "I didn't go to big schools. I didn't wear fine suits. But I believed in showing up, in hammering until something stood, in giving not for credit, but for continuity." He looked down at his hands, thick-knuckled, wrinkled, steady. These hands built more than chairs and tables. They built belief in others, in possibilities. And I watched that belief grow into businesses, into families, into lives that didn't need me until they forgot they once did. A murmur passed through the room. Not disagreement, not shame, recognition. I was told I wasn't part of this anymore, he continued, that I was from another time. Maybe that's true. But if so, let me leave you with something of that time. We didn't ask for seats. We carved them. His voice caught, but he didn't stop. I didn't come back for revenge or applause. I came back because someone asked, "Where is he?" Not, "What did he wear?" Not, "How much did he make?" But simply, "Where is he?" And that question was enough. He handed the microphone back to the woman. She didn't speak. She just nodded and wiped a tear before anyone noticed. And then something happened no one expected. A man in the second row stood up. No words, just stood. Then someone near the wall, then a young girl in a velvet dress. Then the waiter. Then the son. One by one, without cue, the room rose. Not in protest, not in obligation, but in reverence. For the man who had stood for them so many times, without ever asking to be seen. He didn't sit back down, not because he wanted to linger in the moment, but because something in him, long buried, had finally stood up too. And when the room settled again and all those standing slowly returned to their seats, he remained, still holding the memory of silence and the warmth of being seen. Someone gently gestured to the microphone again, but this time he didn't need it. He raised his voice just enough, not loud, but enough for the truth to travel. "I won't blame you," he began, looking not at one person but into the center of the room. "It's easy to turn memory into myth, to forget the hands behind the handshakes, the sweat behind the celebrations. Maybe that's just how time works. It smooths over the edges we once bled from." He folded his hands steady, no tremble. "I came to that dinner because I loved being part of something bigger than me. A family, a story. I didn't come to be thanked. I came to see how far the roots had grown." He paused, his eyes distant now as if sifting through decades. And I realized the tree had grown tall, but forgot the soil it came from. He smiled, not bitterly, gently, like someone forgiving the weather after a storm. I was the kind of man who stayed late to stack chairs after the party, who swept the dust before the guests arrived, who paid the plumber without telling the owner, who made sure the light bulbs worked even if no one saw who changed them. I didn't do that for applause. I did it because I believed in foundations. He glanced at his son. The room held its breath. "I don't blame you," he said again, quieter now. "We all get busy. We all move fast. And when the new replaces the old, it's easier to call it evolution than memory loss." A hush. Even the air in the room felt still. "But I need you all to hear this. I'm done standing in corners, pretending I don't see, pretending I don't feel. I'm not angry. I'm not hurt. But I am finished standing in the shadows of the rooms I helped build." He walked a few steps down the aisle, slowly, each step with quiet resolve. "I will love you all still, but from where I choose, where I don't need to be noticed just to matter." No one moved, because what he said wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And sometimes truth that doesn't blame is the hardest to hear, because it doesn't give you an excuse. It gives you a mirror. He reached the door, hand on the handle, but he didn't walk out. He turned just once. And if one day you wonder why the light doesn't feel as warm as before, it's not because I took it with me. It's because you stopped looking where it came from. And with that, no applause, no music. He stepped outside, into the quiet, into the peace that comes not from being right, but from being real. He thought he had finished, thought his truth had been spoken, his silence redeemed, his heart finally placed where it could rest. But just as he reached the exit, the sound of wood gently scraping floor echoed behind him, not loud but certain. A single chair moved, then another, then more. He paused. He didn't turn back right away, he just listened. It started with the waiter, the same young man who had once brought him water when no one else noticed. Now he stood again, not to serve, but to honor. Then came the teacher, the one who had toasted his name when no one else remembered it, her napkin folded, her gaze steady. Then an older man in the back, quiet, silver-haired, strong posture despite age. His name was rarely said aloud anymore, but those who had been around long enough knew he was the one who co-signed the very first lease of the building. They had built together, bled together, sacrificed dreams for the dreams of others. He stood, then someone else, and another. A woman who once borrowed money from the man and never had the courage to thank him. A cousin who used to play in his backyard as a child and never realized who fixed the fence every time it broke. A former employee who remembered the raise he got the day his child fell sick. Not because he asked, but because someone noticed. And then his daughter. She had been sitting beside her husband all evening, quiet, torn. But when her fingers touched the tablecloth, they gripped it not for support, but to steady the weight of truth as it washed over her. She stood too, and didn't sit back down. Soon the sound of chairs being pushed back became a quiet chorus of apology. No words, just the soft rhythm of people remembering. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was respect, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that arrives late but stays long. His son stood last, not because he was the slowest to understand, but because he was the one who had the most to unlearn. He didn't walk toward his father. He didn't beg for forgiveness in front of the room. He just stood, still, silent, but with eyes that finally saw. And for a moment, no one needed speeches or declarations. The room didn't need to be told what had happened. They had witnessed it. The quiet man who once stood alone, forgotten at the edge of the celebration, now stood with the weight of legacy behind him, not in front of him. Behind, because true honor doesn't pull you forward like a spotlight. It rises like a tide beneath your feet, lifting you when others finally remember who built the shore. He didn't ask for a chair, not when they left him standing, not when he was forgotten by the ones he gave everything to, not even when his knees trembled and the ache in his back reminded him of every beam lifted, every screw turned, every early morning that helped this building exist. He never asked, because some seats must be offered, not taken. But that night, when the whispers faded, when the last toast had been said, when the lights dimmed not from schedule but from reverence, something shifted. Someone brought a chair, not his son. It was the waiter, the young man from earlier. He brought over a single chair, worn but sturdy, and placed it not at the head of the table, not under a spotlight, but in a quiet space where the older guests sat, where memory sat, where gratitude lived. And he gestured. No words, just an open palm, a seat. The old man hesitated, not because he doubted he belonged there, but because, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to choose. He looked across the room. His son stood, hands in pockets, shoulders hunched, eyes filled with the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. His wife beside him. Their children watching, trying to piece together how a man they barely noticed all evening had become the gravity of it. But he didn't walk that way. He turned and walked toward the ones who had stood for him. The teacher, the craftsman, the janitor who once worked weekends because this man let him sleep in the old tool shed, rent-free during a rough season. He sat beside them, not because they were powerful, not because they could change the course of his legacy, but because they had remembered. And remembering in a world that so easily forgets is the truest form of respect. He didn't raise his glass. He didn't make another speech. He just leaned back, hands folded in his lap, and breathed. For the first time in years, he wasn't standing alone. He wasn't a shadow. He was home, and the room, in some quiet understanding, shifted again. The music returned, not loud, software, old, familiar. The kind of music he used to hum when building the first shelf for his son's toy car collection. The kind his late wife danced to barefoot in their old kitchen. It played not for the room, but for the man who finally sat, in the only seat that mattered, not because of where it was placed, but because of who placed it there. And as the evening faded and the chairs were folded, and the lights clicked off one by one, he remained just a little longer, not to be the last to leave, but to savor what it feels like when others stand. not to be above you, but to lift you higher than you ever asked to go.